Madam Speaker, let me first address the questions by several members of Parliament about the rules governing the conduct of ministers, political appointees, and public officers. Ministers and members of this House are well aware that our conduct must always be above board. There is a code of conduct for ministers, which has been in force since 1954. It was last revised and laid before this House in 2005. Ministers and other political appointment holders are notified of this code at the start of each term of office and when a new political office holder is appointed. The code clearly states that a minister must not direct or request a civil servant to do anything or perform any function that may conflict with the civil service's core values of incorruptibility, impartiality, integrity, and honesty. The Code sets out guidelines on what constitutes private interest, requires ministers to disclose these private interests, and states that they should not influence or support issues in which they have a private interest. Ministers are expected to be scrupulously above board and ensure no real or perceived conflict of interest between their official duties and private interests. As Prime Minister Lee had said in his ministerial statement earlier, the Prime Minister sends the rules of prudence after every election to all members of Parliament of the People's Action Party. These rules set out clearly the conduct expected of the members of Parliament, including the need to be proper and above board in their dealings with government departments and public officers. These rules are also released to the media. The public service is also guided by a code of conduct that lays down the principles and rules that public officers must abide by. This is periodically refreshed, and the code of conduct is available to all public officers in hard copies and on the intranet. The public service takes integrity very seriously. Public officers must not undertake any activity that can give rise to any perception that official resources are being used for party political purposes. Public officers are also expected to uphold the integrity and the reputation of the public service and public confidence in it. This includes protecting the confidentiality of information. Any request for information from the public is not granted automatically, but would be carefully assessed on its merits. And this applies to members of the public who happen to be family members of political appointees as well. To ensure that public officers understand and uphold these values, the Code of Conduct is discussed in induction programs for new public officers. Permanent secretaries and statutory board chief executive officers also lead town halls to explain the Code of Conduct to the officers. These town halls include discussions to help officers understand how to interpret and live the code. As I had informed the House on several occasions, there are avenues for public officers to report suspected misconduct directly to their agency heads or permanent secretaries. They may also report to the head of civil service, the Public Service Commission, or to enforcement agencies such as the police or the Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau. Singapore and Singaporeans can justifiably be proud of the hard-earned reputation and long track record of integrity of our public service. We are recognized for a record of integrity by Transparency International and by the World Economic Forum and IMD in their rankings on global competitiveness for the transparency and efficiency of our public institutions. And this is a key pillar of government that Mr. Lee Kuan Yew and our pioneer leaders have built. The public service staunchly believes in and commits itself to living up to the high standards set by Mr. Lee and his founding team. Let me now move on to address the questions several members of Parliament have raised about the Ministerial Committee on number 38 Oxley Road. And I will cover three areas. First, why was the committee formed? Second, what is the work of the committee? And third, what are our next steps? First, why did we set up this committee? There is a significant public interest element involved when considering options for founding Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew's house at number 38 Oxley Road. At the same time, the government has also said that it will pay attention to respecting the wishes of Mr. Lee for his house. These considerations are in addition to the due processes that take place for all buildings and structures with heritage and historical value. There is a misconception that government is seeking to make a decision now. The Ministerial Committee does not decide. It is merely preparing draw plans of various options and their implications so that a future government can refer to them and make a considered and informed decision when the time comes to decide on the matter. The Ministerial Committee has made clear to Mr. Lee Hsien Yang, and in particular to Dr. Lee Wei Ling, that neither the Ministerial Committee nor Cabinet will be making any decision, and there's no decision required so long as Dr. Lee continues staying in the House. This is what Mr. Lee wanted and expressed in his will. It might be 20 to 30 years later before a decision needs to be made. However, if Dr. Lee chooses to leave earlier, say within a few months, then Cabinet and government will have to decide, and it would be useful to have studied the different options. Some of us in Cabinet, including me, also felt that it would be a useful element for a future government deciding on the House if it had a set of options that came from ministers who had personally discussed this matter with Mr. Lee. Following the passing of Mr. Lee Kuan Yew on the 23rd of March 2015, Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong informed Cabinet on 15th April 2015 that he would recuse himself from all government decisions to be taken on the House. This is in accordance with the guidelines in paragraphs 3 and 4 of the Code of Conduct for Ministers. It was proper for PM to recuse himself, as there is a conflict of interest between his public role as the head of government and his private role as the son of Mr. Lee, and in addition, because he had been bequeathed the property. As PM had recused himself, I chair Cabinet should any deliberations take place on this property. Cabinet had recorded this at its meeting on the 15th of April 2015. On the 1st of June 2016, at a Cabinet meeting which I chaired, Cabinet approved the proposal by the Minister for National Development to set up a ministerial committee to draw up the range of possible options for 38 Oxley Road. Prior to this, work on this issue had been carried out at staff level, with interagency consultations as needed, with matters being surfaced by relevant ministers to me or Cabinet without PM when necessary. I had supported the Minister for National Development's proposal, as setting up such a ministerial committee would improve coordination and oversight on this matter. I chair this committee on the property at 38 Oxley Road and included the relevant Cabinet members. That is, the Minister for Culture, Community and Youth, Grace Fu, for Heritage, Minister for Law, K. Shamagun, for Land Issues, and Minister for National Development, Lawrence Wong, for Urban Planning. This committee is like numerous other committees that Cabinet may set up from time to time to study specific issues. For instance, on smart nation and digital government, population, national research, and on climate change, which I happen to chair. And DPM Taman has provided examples of other committees that he chairs, such as the Changi East developments. We even have a task force now looking at infant formula. They are all part of the normal working process of Cabinet, or indeed the board of any large organization. We would rarely need to announce the formation of such committees, as they often relate to internal working processes and coordination within the government. There's nothing unusual about this. This is similar in approach to cabinet committees set up by many other governments. These committees ultimately report to the cabinet, which operates under the principle of collective cabinet responsibility. Now, this is an important consideration because members of cabinet may have differing perspectives, but once cabinet decides, members take collective responsibility for the decision. And this remains a valid consideration for us. Second, on the work of the committee. The terms of reference of this committee are to assess the historical and heritage significance of the property. 2, the wishes of Mr. Lee Kuan Yew in relation to the property. And 3, the possible plans for the property and the neighborhood and the options to move forward. As we wanted to get the views of Mr. Lee's children, Mr. Lee Hsien Loong, Dr. Lee Wei Ling, and Mr. Lee Hsien Yang, were duly informed separately in writing on the 27th of July 2016 that a ministerial committee, of which I was the chairman, had been formed to consider the options for 38 Oxley Road and the implications thereof, and the committee would look into various aspects, including what Mr. Lee Kuan Yew's thinking on the matter was. I will now elaborate on these 3 aspects of the terms of reference. With regard to the first aspect of the terms of reference for the committee, why does the government need to get involved in this matter at all? The government has the responsibility to consider the public interest aspects of any property with historical and heritage significance, and has a range of powers to gazette or acquire such property. I should emphasize that government not only has the legal powers to act, but indeed the responsibility to decide on what to do. Government cannot outsource decision-making on this. And ultimately, the government of the day has to decide and carry the decision. The government has to carefully consider the merits for each property to be preserved or conserved. Currently, 72 buildings and structures are gazetted as national monuments, some of which were private residences. And we have conserved over 7,000 buildings. Now, many of these predate our independence and hark back to our early immigrant and colonial era, such as Admiralty House, the House of Tan Yeok Nee, and the Sun Yat-sen Nanyang Memorial Hall. We have precious few from our independence era. And there have been calls to conserve these, such as several blocks of SIT flats in Tiong Bahru. For those who are not familiar with what SIT stands for, that's the Singapore Improvement Trust, the precursor of the Housing and Development Board. In the 1960s through to the 1980s, we cleared whole precincts and demolished many buildings for urban development to make way for the new in land-scarce Singapore. There was an urgent need for decent housing and industrial and commercial land for jobs, all for our people. When we look back, we were perhaps, in some cases, overzealous in doing so. Indeed, as fewer such precincts or buildings remained, the value of each of them as a link to the past became more salient. Old shop houses and warehouses, Peranakan houses, black and whites, and Bukit Brown. With the passing years and fading memories, more Singaporeans too began to yearn to keep these gradually dwindling, remaining physical links to our past, either for their architectural typology or the history they embody. In some cases, the property owners or members of the public argued to retain the buildings. For example, the old National Library building not so long ago. But they had to make way for development needs. In other cases, owners applied for redevelopment, but were directed to conserve the buildings for their historic or heritage value, often foregoing considerable financial gains they might have reaped from redevelopment. There is a due process for considering such matters, and the decision is never taken lightly. The ultimate decision is made by government. The Minister for National Development will elaborate on this later in his speech. These public interests and considerations apply to 38 Oxley Road as well. It was home to our founding Prime Minister. It was in its basement dining room that many important discussions and critical decisions on the future of Singapore were made by Mr. Lee and our pioneer leaders. As Mr. Lee and our pioneer generation of leaders, in fact, our pioneer generation, pass on, the historical significance of markers of this period has grown. Number 38 Oxley Road is a key marker of this turning point in our history. Since we do not need to decide now how best to maintain this important historical link to the past, it might be best, for the time being, to avoid taking irreversible steps such as demolition and redevelopment of the site, so that we have the benefit of time to consider the matter and the merits of various options with a perspective of history. A key consideration for 38 Oxley Road is Mr. Lee's thinking on the property, which brings me to the second aspect of the terms of reference. The committee has been paying particular attention to respecting Mr. Lee Kuan Yew's wishes as we look at the range of possible options. And this is the reason why we had sought views from Mr. Lee's children. When Mr. Lee met Cabinet in July 2011, he expressed his wish for the house to be demolished. But Mr. Lee also listened carefully to the views of the Cabinet members. It was not a stormy discussion. It was a considered discussion where he presented his views and he listened to the views expressed by the Cabinet members. While Mr. Lee expressed his personal wishes, he was also very proper. Mr. Lee did not direct the government. He was aware of the government's responsibilities and how the law on this matter operates. Mr. Lee wrote to Cabinet 5 months later, informing us that he had reflected on the matter. And earlier today, the Prime Minister read out to members of this House the letter that Mr. Lee had written to Cabinet. This was Mr. Lee's last formal communication with Cabinet on this matter. Subsequently, as we have learned from the beneficiaries of his estate, he had also expressed his wishes on the property in paragraph 7 of his last will. Members will also be aware of this. This paragraph had 2 main limbs, with a third limb saying that this paragraph could be made public so that his wishes are known. The Ministerial Committee wrote to all Mr. Lee's children on the 27th of July 2016, shortly after the committee was formed, to invite them to share with the committee any views they would like on Mr. Lee's thinking on the property and the context and circumstances relating to his thinking beyond what had already been stated in public, so that these could be taken into account. Indeed, it's only natural that the committee should ask the siblings for their views. The siblings wrote to us, providing differing views, including on the drafting of the last will. We then provided each party 2 opportunities to comment on the views of the other party. Indeed, the fact that the committee received differing views showed how essential it was that we had sought the views of the siblings on Mr. Lee's wishes and thinking. Madam Speaker, Mr. Lee Hsien Yang has made various allegations about the committee which are baseless. He has repeated the same allegations today, ignoring the replies that have been provided to him in writing. In fact, since the very beginning, when he was first informed of the setting up of the committee. If I may draw members' attention to the response from my press secretary yesterday, and I seek Madam Speaker's permission to circulate this response to members.
Yes, please.
Exchanges have been coming to and fro quite rapidly, and members may not have digested this fully. So, if Madam Speaker, I will read this out. Mr. Lee Hsien Yang's statement on the 2nd of July 2017 presents a selective and inaccurate account of his exchanges with the Ministerial Committee on 38 Oxley Road House. Selective and inaccurate. The committee sought Mr. Lee Hsien Yang and Dr. Lee Wei Ling's views on the late Mr. Lee's wishes and thinking in July 2016. In its initial letters, the committee had made clear to Mr. Lee Hsien Yang and Dr. Lee Wei Ling the purpose and scope of the committee's work. And this includes why the committee was formed, who it reports to, namely Cabinet, 3, what it would look into, and 4, why Mr. Lee Hsien Yang and Dr. Lee Wei Ling, and of course, Mr. Lee Hsien Loong's input would be useful. The committee told him clearly that it was listing the various options for the House to present to Cabinet. The committee was not going to make any recommendations. The government had no intention of making any decision on the House as long as Dr. Lee Wei Ling resides there, and Mr. Lee Hsien Yang had acknowledged this in one of his subsequent replies. As such, it was clear to all parties involved that the government was not making an immediate decision on the House, and that no decision may be necessary for another 20 to 30 years. I have enclosed letters dated 27th of July 2016, shortly after the committee was formed, and 24th August 2016 to Mr. Lee Hsien Yang and Dr. Lee Wei Ling, which make these points very clear. The committee has no power to decide on the validity of the last will. This too was made clear to Mr. Lee Hsien Yang on the 25th of April 2017. That the committee is not the place where decisions on the legal validity of the last will can be made, and this is a matter between him and Mr. Lee Hsien Loong. So this was made very clear to Dr. Lee and Mr. Lee Hsien Yang on the 25th of April. I have not included that letter because I don't want to swamp members with voluminous exchanges of letters. The committee also made clear to Mr. Lee Hsien Yang from the outset that his provision of any reply was purely voluntary. On this basis, Mr. Lee Hsien Yang proceeded to make various submissions to the committee, both last year and into this year. The circumstances of the last will became relevant for a good reason. And this is because Mr. Lee Hsien Yang's representations to the committee placed reliance on one part of the last will as the primary evidence of Mr. Lee's intent. He wanted the committee to focus on one part of the clause relating to Mr. Lee's wishes on the House and not its other part. When the circumstances related to the drafting of the last will were brought to the committee's attention, Mr. Lee Hsien Yang's views on this were sought. And in the same vein, I might add, the committee had also posed questions to Mr. Lee Hsien Loong, some of them uncomfortable ones, based on representations made by Mr. Lee Hsien Yang and Dr. Lee Wei Ling. Madam Speaker, I'm quite puzzled by all this secret committee business. First of all, Dr. Lee Wei Ling and Mr. Lee Hsien Yang knew about the committee. We informed them shortly after the committee was formed on the 27th of July 2016. So they knew about it. We also informed them what the committee was setting out to do. This was on the 27th of July 2016, and in response to his questions, we expanded on that, gave him some reassurances, and you can see that in the letter of 24th of August. They were also invited to make representations to the committee. The committee wasn't looking at things in isolation. Now, how can they be making representations to a committee if this was a secret committee and they didn't know it existed? This doesn't make sense at all. So they gave their views and they offered them freely and voluntarily. And they were also told clearly on the 25th of April this year that the committee is not looking into the validity of the will, and its only interest is in understanding Mr. Lee's wishes better. So, Madam Speaker, going through the facts and the chronology, Dr. Lee Wei Ling and Dr. Lee Hsien Yang, we must ask them, are they being truthful and honest when they allege that this is some mysterious committee which they didn't know about, which was only acknowledged after Dr. Lee Wei Ling and Mr. Lee Hsien Yang somehow exposed its existence? They knew about it. They were responding to it and sent several representations. They knew what the committee was doing, and so there's nothing mysterious about it, or there shouldn't be. Madam Speaker, just because Mr. Lee Hsien Yang may have found some questions inconvenient to answer, that does not mean that the committee was abusing its power or doing something wrong. It was giving an opportunity for parties to express their views. Consider, if the committee had not asked the siblings for their views, it would have been a significant omission, and then, in such a situation, the siblings might be justifiably upset that the committee had not given them an opportunity to make their views known or to make clarifications, which another party may have put in, which differed from theirs. But all the siblings were provided a full opportunity to do so. The siblings should therefore really have no reason to be unhappy with being asked, being given the opportunity to make voluntary representations, to offer their views, and to make clarifications. Madam Speaker, so what is the committee's interest? Our interest is confined to obtaining as full a picture as possible of Mr. Lee's thinking on the House. Now we have to decide. If we want to take Mr. Lee's views into consideration, then we must understand what they were. If we decide that we are not going to take Mr. Lee's views into consideration at all, then we don't need to ask. But if we want to know and get as full a picture as possible of what Mr. Lee's views were, then it is incumbent on the committee to try to determine these as best as we can. I should emphasize again that it is not for the committee to decide whose claims are valid, in particular over the validity of the will. And we had explained this, as I said, on the 25th of April 2017 in writing to Mr. Lee Hsien Yang and Dr. Lee Wei Ling. What we do try is to understand as best as we can Mr. Lee's wishes and thinking. We had also explained that all the representations and views offered were voluntary. Mr. Lee Hsien Loong provided his representations in the form of 3 statutory declarations. But there was no need for any party to respond if they did not wish to provide views or clarifications, and no need for them to put their views down as statutory declarations either. But we did tell all of them that any views provided would be useful, and the committee will consider all the views offered. Madam Speaker, we should be clear that the difference of views had origins that arose before the formation of the committee in June 2016. Indeed, soon after Mr. Lee's passing, the allegations of dynastic ambitions and abuse of power were already being made to many people in smaller circles. I know because several people spoke to me about having been approached and offered these allegations and views, and they expressed their concern to me. So this was shortly after Mr. Lee's passing, well before formation of any committee. In April 2016, before the committee was formed, Dr. Lee Wei Ling had made a public posting making such allegations. I don't recall that Mr. Lee Hsien Yang disassociated himself from these postings either. Saying that the committee has somehow now pushed Mr. Lee Hsien Yang to take these allegations public, therefore does not conform to the facts and the chronology. Madam Speaker, I am not in a position to opine why Mr. Lee Hsien Yang now makes such a claim and his motivation for doing so. Both parties made representations to the committee that might have been uncomfortable to the other. Each party's views were circulated with their permission to the other party, and both parties were offered opportunities to respond if they wished. This is being open and transparent with all the parties. Being given the opportunity to voluntarily clarify issues, even though they may be uncomfortable, can hardly be considered an abuse of power. The committee is not the reason for these differences. The committee is merely trying to get the best understanding of Mr. Lee's thinking on the property. As there are differences of views, it may be useful to have a contemporaneous record of what these are, so that they can be referred to if needed when a decision is needed to be taken eventually. I should also point out that the committee carried out its work through direct correspondence in writing with the siblings and out of the public eye. The committee did not think that it was useful for these differences to be aired in public. But the siblings' views had relevance to the committee's work because it helps the committee take Mr. Lee's wishes into account along with the public interest aspects when drawing up the range of options for the property. We hope that the differences of views on private matters can be resolved within the family, but ultimately, the government of the day and its ministers cannot avoid taking responsibility for making the required decisions on matters involving the public interest. And this is why Singapore has laws that give the government powers, specifically the Preservation of Monuments Act and the Planning Act in this case. As members have asked, this does not preclude consultations or the involvement of some memorial committee at an appropriate time. In fact, I think this will be useful. Members of the public have already written in offering suggestions. At the appropriate time, I will see how best to seek wider public views on this. But I suppose I also have to weigh this against those who might jump to the conclusion that doing so means that the government is imminently going to decide or do something with the property when there is no need to decide now. Madam Speaker, I wish to point out an irony in this matter. If PM Lee had not recused himself and had simply, as the Prime Minister, ordered the government agencies to demolish the house without due process, that would have been an abuse of power and authority. It would have bypassed the objective due process that Mr. Lee himself would have stood for. Instead, Prime Minister Lee did the proper thing, recused himself, and let the cabinet, without him, chaired by me, decide on how to proceed with the matter. It is ironic that following the proper process is now being labelled by some as an abuse of power. Perhaps it is because they feel that their demand for a particular outcome should simply be carried out. But simply doing this would be an abuse of power. Going through due process is the proper way of doing things. Anyone who has run a major listed company would or should know how companies deal with conflicts of interest, even where it involves the chairman or the CEO. Take, for example, a property company that is going to bid for an en bloc redevelopment. If the chairman or CEO happens to own apartment units in the development, they would have to recuse themselves. Others in the company would then have to be empowered to decide on the company's bid. We now come to the third aspect of the terms of reference of the committee, the due process to develop possible plans and options for the property. No decision is required now on what to do with the property. The government had stated on several occasions that it will not do anything to affect Dr. Lee Wei Ling's right to continue living at 38 Oxley Road. And as I said earlier, this was made clear to the siblings in writing that neither the committee nor cabinet will make any decision on the house, and that the committee is only listing and studying the various options as drawer plans. Even though no decision is needed now, it is prudent to commence that due process, which is needed to consider the various options before making any decision on the house, as with all properties of significant public interest. This will take some time, and the government has to study the options in advance of any eventualities. For instance, if Dr. Lee chooses to move out of the house in the near future, a decision on what to do about the house might have to be taken at that point. On the options for the house, the committee does not take a binary either-or approach. The committee has no preconceived notion that a house must be kept as it is or that it must be totally demolished. Instead, the committee's approach is to study and prepare a range of options for the property and the neighborhood so that a future government can make an informed and considered decision when it becomes necessary, always taking into account Mr. Lee's views. A range of intermediate options is possible. I met Mr. Lee Hsien Yang 5 times in 2015, between 14th of April and July 2015, and once more, the 6th time, in April 2016, on a range of issues. The meetings were before the Ministerial Committee was formed. In our meeting on the 27th of April 2015, we talked about various possibilities for the property. I informed Mr. Lee Hsien Yang that I would personally not support the options at either end of the range. At one end, preserving the house as it is for visitors to enter and see the private spaces would be totally against the wishes of Mr. and Mrs. Lee Kuan Yew. And at the other end, demolishing the house and putting the property on the market to develop new private residences, such as luxury apartments. And this remains my view. The latter, redevelopment into private apartments, would not only result in the loss of a historically significant property, but also allow this very history to be exploited for private profit. For example, by marketing the residences as living at the former house of Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. I'm certain many Singaporeans would not have approved of this. Indeed, Mr. Lee Hsien Yang has also acknowledged this, and on 1st July 2017 has said that he has no inclination to do so. The committee has been studying various intermediate options, such as demolishing the house but keeping the basement dining room with an appropriate heritage center attached. The dining room was where many important historical meetings were held to discuss how a self-governing Singapore would take shape. I personally think there are merits in these intermediate options which could provide a good solution. But these studies are ongoing. Mr. Lee Hsien Yang has, in his public statements, also indicated that he is open to some of these options. Mr. Lee Hsien Yang also acknowledges that no decision is needed now, as Dr. Lee Wei Ling continues to live in the property. And this is also the position of the government. In his statement on the 1st of July, he also said that he recognizes that no man stands above the law. Indeed, as I've explained, government has a duty to go through due process for when a decision needs to be taken at some future time. And so we both acknowledge that. So there should really be no reason to disagree with what the committee is doing. We told him what we're doing. He knows we exist. And we are studying the possible options for the time when a decision has to be made. So third, what are our next steps? Mr. Lee Hsien Yang now owns the property. As provided for in Mr. Lee Kuan Yew's will, Dr. Lee Wei Ling can stay in it for as long as she wishes. And we have said that we will not do anything to affect Dr. Lee's right to continue living there. So there's no decision required of the government so long as Dr. Lee stays there and the house is properly maintained as provided for under the Building Control Act and the Planning Act. Even if the government were to take a position today, it would not bind a future government at the time when that future government has to make a decision and implement it. We can't take a prospective decision and say 30 years from now the future government will do this, because the future government has the powers under the law to decide for itself. Madam Speaker, the studies on the options for the House are continuing. While there is no urgency to complete these studies within a specified time frame, these are all drawer plans which will be reviewed periodically, I will consult my colleagues to see if it is useful to put out a range of possibilities to let the public ponder on the matter without having to arrive at any decision. Emotions on this issue are still very strong, not just within the family, but also among some Singaporeans. Emotions have sadly been heightened again by this public disagreement. A period of calm would be useful for reflection. With the passage of time, I hope that we will be able to arrive at a wise decision on this matter in an informed and considered way that takes into account the significant public interest to preserve the heritage of our young nation while respecting Mr. Lee's personal wishes for the House. Madam Speaker, I have explained to this House the robust processes that the government has for dealing with and avoiding conflicts of interest. I explained that the Ministerial Committee was formed to examine the historical and heritage significance of the property, the wishes of Mr. Lee Kuan Yew in relation to the property, and the possible plans for the property and the neighbourhood and the options to move forward. And these are all matters which the government has to take responsibility for and has to plan for. This is just the normal process of government doing its work in a calm, objective, and proper way. In the coming days, we will fully debate the specific allegations that have been made against the government and examine whether there's any substance behind them. Even as we do so, I hope that members will leave enough room for the private issues to be worked through within the family. But we must not shy away from dealing decisively with the public issues and the allegations which go to the heart of our system of clean and honest government, and we must do so for the good of Singapore. I urge members to ask me, my cabinet colleagues, probing questions on any aspect of these allegations which you feel is relevant, and clear any doubts that you may have. We must keep our public institutions neutral and not have allegations hurled at our public officers without basis. At the end of this session, Singaporeans should have their confidence in the honesty of our government and our public officers strengthened. We make decisions and act in the public interests of Singaporeans. We do not bend to the private demands of individuals, no matter who they are or what family connections they can claim. And this is the foundation upon which Mr. Lee Kuan Yew and his team built our Singapore for all of us. Mr. Lee would have expected no less from us. This is the Singapore that we want to continue living in. And this is the Singapore that Prime Minister Lee, our cabinet colleagues, and I, and all our public officers in our agencies will fight to uphold and take forward. We have many real challenges and much to do. So let us focus together on these and work together to continue to serve Singaporeans and bring Singapore forward. This is what Mr. Lee would have wanted us to do more than anything else. Thank you, Madam Speaker.